Hi, and welcome to today's video lecture on solutions to climate change with the subtitle, Why Isn't More Being Done? A lot of you asked me after the last video lecture, if we know that climate change is bad and we know that our activities lead to climate change, why don't we just stop? Why don't we stop polluting and stop emitting greenhouse gases and stop climate change? And today is an exploration of that topic. I will try as best I can to give some of the answers to that question, because that question is not simple. It's not just an easy yes or no answer. There is no easy, simple way to explain this, but there are several reasons, and I will try to explain a few of them. First, we need to understand the difference between private and governmental action. When we say private, we mean, yes, private citizens like ourselves, but also private companies and private corporations. Private in this case means owned by individuals, owned by us people, or the people who own corporations, or the people who produce things. But private here means owned by people. Governmental or nationalized means owned by the state. The state, of course, is also all the people in it, but it's different to private in that something done by the state has to be decided and carried out by a legislature, which means people have to vote, make rules, and the people's elected representatives have to do this work. In short, to summarize, governmental action requires people who have been elected, like the government, to do the work to make suggestions into laws and to act on those laws, whereas private action can be determined by the people in question, by private citizens or private companies. There are different ways of approaching climate change, and we are now discussing the difference between private and governmental. Privately, people are doing many things to combat climate change. People recycle, as we can see in this picture. People sort their different wastes or types of trash into different boxes, and those things can then be reused or remade into new things. For example, recycling paper, returning cans and bottles, and returning plastics. All of these are ways of recycling. And then there's public transportation. People use the bus or the train or the tram instead of their car. Some people walk or cycle instead of using a car or public transportation, which is, of course, the most environmentally friendly because cycling has no emissions. And other people do other things, such as pick up trash in nature, on the beaches, in the forests, to throw in the proper place. Some people buy second-hand instead of buying new things. For example, if you get your bookshelves from Finn instead of buying new ones in the store. And some people reduce their shopping. They buy less or fewer things. Some people reduce their meat intake, like we saw in the documentary Before the Flood. Meat is one of the biggest contributors to climate change in terms of gas emissions. CO2, methane, other greenhouse gases are being let out in huge amounts by the meat industry. And so by reducing the amount of meat you eat, you can help reduce your climate change effect. Now, these are all things that private citizens can do. Stop flying, eat less meat, shop less, recycle your trash, use a bike, walk, or public transportation instead of private transportation. These are all personal or private things to do to combat climate change. Now, if we're talking about states, nationally or several countries globally, there are other solutions to the climate change crisis. There are other things we can do to combat climate change. There was also mention in the documentary of greenhouse gas or carbon taxes. That means that when people pollute, they should have to pay for it, which will hopefully encourage people to pollute less. Because if you have to pay to do something, you don't want to do it as much as if it's free, especially if your goal is making money. So one of the suggestions is that governments and countries place a tax on carbon emissions, which would mean that big companies and companies that pollute heavily would have to pay for it. That would encourage those companies to find other ways to pollute less, so they wouldn't have to pay for it. Another thing that must be considered is when we think about the oceans. Also mentioned in the documentary, oceans are one of the best ways to combat climate change because oceans help reduce CO2 in the atmosphere. But our oceans are being polluted and they are being damaged, and the animals in them are no longer thriving like they were. So in order to stop damaging the oceans, so they may once again help us in combating climate change, we must pass laws that make it illegal to damage the oceans, for example, by overfishing. These laws can only be passed nationally or governmentally. Private people, private citizens, you and me, we can't just decide that it's not that people are not allowed to pollute the oceans, because so long as there is money in polluting the oceans, it will be done unless it is illegal. The same goes for production, like you can see in the third picture here. Production of goods and production of power and production of pretty much anything will release gases into the atmosphere. Now, it is possible to build huge plants or factories that trap carbon gases, that trap CO2. There is a way of cleaning the air by separating the CO2 and other gases, and then to sort of contain or keep the CO2 in special containers and to filter that out of the air. It is possible to build such plants, but they will be expensive, and this will have to be done governmentally. Unless private citizens suddenly decide they want to give all their money to save the earth, and this has never happened yet, even though we know there is a climate crisis going on, the money to build CO2 plants will have to come from the governments of the world. The same goes for laws to restrict pollution, laws that make it illegal to let out too much CO2. Laws that make it illegal to emit dangerous greenhouse gases, those will have to be done or written by the government and by the people who make laws. Those people are elected, of course. That means chosen to do their job by the public, but the public in general can't just suddenly decide to make it illegal to emit greenhouse gases. And we must ask ourselves, which is more efficient? Which helps more? Should it be a private responsibility to stop climate change and to stop greenhouse gas emissions? Or should it be a governmental responsibility? Is it my job as a person, as a private citizen, to save the earth? Or is it the government's job? To answer that question, we must ask ourselves, which will help more, which will do make the bigger difference, private or public action. If you look at these column graphs or infographics, they're not graphs, they're infographics. If you look at the left-hand side one, this is from Illustrert Vitenskap, they have compared the biggest emitters of CO2, and they have ranked them by number from the worst to the least bad, and that is, the first is energy. And energy, that is everything that requires power. Whether you turn on your light or use your cell phone, or whether you cook or you turn on your TV, all of that requires energy, and that is the biggest emitter of all of CO2. Then we have industry, and that is factories and the places that make things for us. Everything you own is made somewhere. Every last little thing has to be made and produced in some kind of factory or workshop. And those factories let out a whole lot of CO2. Those are actually the second largest polluter. In third place, we find agriculture, which means all the people that make our food, all the production of food. And it says that most of this CO2, most of the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture comes from the production of meat, especially cattle. That means cows, bulls. That means hamburgers. That means steaks. That means beef. Ground beef that you put in your tacos, and the hamburgers from McDonald's, and all the red meat that we eat almost every day that is produced by agriculture lets out a lot of CO2. And in fourth place, we have waste, trash, strictly speaking, and taking care of our trash, all the trash we produce, all the things that we have but throw away, and all the plastic wrappings around our food, and everything that we produce by way of waste will have to be dealt with, and that is in fourth place. If you look at the pink little wheel there, you can see that this is from the US though, just the US, and you can see that out of all the emissions, GHG, that means greenhouse gases, you can see that the biggest two emitters are transportation and electricity. Commercial and residential, that means where people live, and shops and people stuff, is in fourth place with 12%, but that is not much compared to the almost 60% dealt by transportation and electricity. Finally, we know that 100 companies in the entire world are responsible for 71% of global greenhouse gas emissions. And the top 10, the 10 companies in the world that pollute the very most, are the ones mentioned here. And these are all oil, gas, and coal companies. Every single one of these, the 10 worst polluters in the world, deal in greenhouse gas, heavy or very polluting materials, coal, oil, and gas, also known as fossil fuels. So obviously, we know what causes greenhouse gas emissions. It is the burning of fossil fuels. So why isn't more being done? And this is the million-dollar question, as they say. The easy answer to that is because people don't care enough, and because a lot of money is being made. You might remember from the documentary Before the Flood that a lot of people are making a lot of money off of this. The people with an interest in oil, coal, and gas. And that's sometimes entire governments, like Norway's government. Most of our wealth comes from oil, the production and burning of oil. And it is to do with private citizens, the people who own oil wells and oil companies. And let's be really, really honest about this. What are you willing to do? Are you willing to stop shopping and eat less meat and drive the bus instead of a car and don't fly? Because flying, shopping, and meat are the biggest contributors that people contribute instead of states. So the easy answer to this question is we could do a lot of things, but we don't seem to be willing to do them.